Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. Intelligence community workers don't like to talk about intelligence failures. Nobody likes to talk about failures. But spies, lies, and sneaky guys are always trying to avoid failure. For a long time after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the U.S. wondered how it could have missed the impending failure of the biggest threat to U.S. national security in 40 years. When President Kennedy sent U.S. troops to invade Cuba in 1961, they were embarrassingly rebuffed by Fidel Castro's forces. In 2003, when President George W. Bush invaded Iraq, he expected to unearth, pretty quickly, secret caches of biological and nuclear weapons materials. Almost a decade later, we know there were none. When President Reagan tried to negotiate with Iran to stop the killing and hostage-taking of Americans in the Middle East, he was embarrassed by a convoluted scheme of weapons shipments flowing to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. And for the U.S., of course, the 9/11 attacks might have been the mother of all intelligence failures. To help address such failures, the CIA and others in the intelligence community have tried to build into their system a devil's advocate operation. These red cells are supposed to challenge the CIA's assumptions at every turn, theoretically exposing intelligence shortcomings before they develop into embarrassments. Our speaker tonight, Eric Anderson, is part of that red cell operation working for the CIA. Since the 1990s, he's worked at the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and as a senior intelligence officer for the U.S. government in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. As a career intelligence officer, Anderson has written over 600 articles for the National Intelligence Council, the International Security Advisory Board, and the Department of Defense. Anderson served as a senior intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's been a senior intelligence analyst for the multinational forces in Iraq, in Baghdad, and at the U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii. From 1990 to 2000, he was an active duty intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force, with assignments in Japan, Korea, and Saudi Arabia. He remains on duty today as an Air Force Reserve officer and is now teaching at the National Defense Intelligence College. Eric Anderson is author of Take the Money and Run: Sovereign Wealth Funds and the Demise of American Prosperity, published in 2009. He's working on a book about our fear of China called Sinophobia. A previous book called China Restored: The Middle Kingdom Looks Forward to 2020 was published in 2010, and his most recent work about adopting his daughter is called Adopting Ainsley: There's No Place for a Car Seat on a Motorcycle. Anderson earned his PhD in political science from the University of Missouri, a master's degree from Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Illinois Wesleyan University. Please welcome Eric Anderson to the University of Delaware.
Thank you. Are we on? Hi. Is the mic working? Okay. I told the group this afternoon when I went to talk to them, A, I'm a wanderer, so you'll have to deal with me. I have notes, so I'll have to wander back periodically. And B, when I looked at the title for this program, it says, spies, lies, and sneaky guys. I'm not a spy. I'm not. I don't collect intelligence against people. I'm not tasked with that mission. And I'm not a sneaky guy. I don't have an alias. My mail comes to my name at my address. My emails all have the right name on them. But I do tell lies. Okay? I'm paid to tell lies. And as I told the group this afternoon, I said, the only people who get away with being wrong more than analysts in the intelligence community are the weathermen. So with that in mind, thank you, Ralph, again for inviting me. I'm going to step into why we have a red cell. Ralph has given you a good idea of what we formally were tasked to accomplish. But I want to show you the examples of where things have really gone wrong. And I want to open up with an example that now is 60 years old. Bear with me. Let's step back to 4 December 1941. And the intelligence community, as existed at that point in time, is tasked with writing an estimate for the President of the United States that lays out evidence concerning Japanese intentions and where they're going next in the Pacific. When we look at the report that's been sketched out and handed to people in Washington, D.C. that day, you find that the majority position is one that says the evidence, and this is the quote they use, concerning Japanese military intentions with respect to U.S. targets in the Pacific is scattered and ambiguous. They don't know. This is the typical intelligence problem, right? But a majority of the entities preparing this estimate believe that a near-term attack on U.S. targets is unlikely. 4 December. Now, there's a minority position in this. You have 2 entities within the community who've said, no, we'd like to talk to you about other evidence. One of them will become the National Security Agency. The other will become what we now call today the Central Intelligence Agency. Here's the minority position. There is at least an even chance. This is analysts that work in the intelligence community. We don't lie, we just put a lot of caveats on it, right? There's at least an even chance the Japanese military forces will attack the Philippines and Hawaii in the immediate future. 4 December. Now, why are they reaching that conclusion? This is actual declassified information from 1941. We know, the minority argues, that the Japanese Foreign Ministry sent a cable out using the following language: east wind rain. And we believe that that message is indicative of a decision by the Japanese to go to war in the very near future. We know that because we have it in SIGINT, Signals Intelligence. We know, via communications intercepts, that on 22 November, the Japanese ambassador to Washington said that if things weren't settled by 29 November, after that, things are going to automatically happen. We know. Connect the dot. We know from intercepts of Japanese traffic that just 3 days ago, they changed the call signs. Call signs are the identifiers that people use to, in their own military, identify a ship. They change regularly because you want to be able to disguise your movements. But typically, the Japanese military changed their call signs every 6 months. This time, they changed the call signs less than 30 days ago, and now they changed them 3 days ago. In my world, working as a military analyst, that's bad karma. We know that. It gets worse. We know, again, from communications intercepts, this time from the Foreign Ministry again, that the embassies, and this is the Japanese embassies, in Washington, London, Manila, Singapore, and Hong Kong, so we've got, the big 8 there, right, have been ordered to destroy all but the most important documents, codes, and ciphers in their safes. Okay, when you know something like that, in the indications of warning world, you call the boss at night in bed. We know that the aircraft carriers that are in Japan's fleet are missing, but we don't know where they're at. We know, based on historical analysis, that they have paid close attention to what the Brits have been doing to attack the Italian fleet. In fact, what the Brits were using were aircraft dropping torpedoes on Italian ships in port. And we have reason to suspect, based on sketchy human, human is always sketchy, trust me. Right? This is the spies telling me what they think. That the Japanese have been practicing that tactic of dropping torpedoes from airplanes on ships in harbor in ports in southern Japan. We have reason to believe they're doing that. Now again, this is the minority position. This is, at least in our world, supposed to be the red cell, talking back to the majority, saying, look at the evidence you have at hand. Maybe we should be rethinking the majority position. it always helps to use your own operations forces on themselves. So here we have the minority side saying, and by the way, guys, exercises conducted at the Naval War College and at other military institutions reveal that Hawaii would be vulnerable to a sudden Japanese aerial attack, particularly if it's conducted on a Sunday morning. We know that. They did the exercise at the War College 6 months before the attack happened. And we note, by the way, that the head of the Army's Hawaiian Air Corps and the head of Hawaii's Naval Air Patrol concluded that the most dangerous form of attack on Oahu would be an air attack conducted at sunrise, and that there would be a probability that it would be, quote, delivered as a complete surprise. That NIE was never written. That estimate never was produced. But 3 days before the attack, we knew that information. It was in place, it was in the policymakers' hands, it was in a scattered format, and on 7 December, the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor. Nobody produced the minority side of the report. Now let's flash forward 60 years. I always like it when you start with the recitation of intelligence failures. We never get any credit for the successes, by the way. There are lots of dead Taliban. That's a success, guys. Here's the 9/11 Commission report, written after the fact. We believe that the 9/11 attacks revealed 4 kinds of failures: in imagination, in policy, the policy guys didn't get off this time, in capabilities, and in management. Now, I'm not going to talk about the policy community. I don't want to get fired. I still have to pay my mortgage. And we're not going to talk about capabilities because you had General Hayden in here, and he's really good about advertising what he used to do. And I don't do management. I'm an analyst. I have 2 managers. They do the paperwork. What we're going to talk about here is imagination. What is it that the analysts should have told us before we went into 9/11? Here's the scathing indictment from the 9/11 Commission. In July 1995, so they went back, they can read, a national intelligence estimate was produced that predicted a future terrorist attack against the United States. Okay, so you tell the policymaker that in the future somebody's going to attack you. In that 1995 estimate, they also said that attack will probably focus on 3 areas: the White House, the Capitol, and symbols of capitalism, such as Wall Street and the 2 towers. The 1995 estimate also described as the greatest danger, and this is their verbiage, transient groupings of individuals, like, say, 15 guys who are going to get on planes, that lacked strong organization, but rather are loose affiliations. This is the description of Al-Qaeda as we've come to know it. That operate outside, and this again, their verbiage, traditional circles, but have access to a worldwide network of training facilities and safe havens. That's Afghanistan. But there's no mention of bin Laden in the 1995 estimate. None. We know he's there, but the community doesn't feel that it warrants inclusion within the National Intelligence Estimate that goes forth to the principal policy advisors within the U.S. government. So it stays out. By 1996 and 1997, we are painfully aware of bin Laden's presence. In fact, one of your colleagues in the news media broke his jihadist comments. John Miller showed up on 2020 as an interview where bin Laden says, "I'm going to conduct a war against the West." We largely ignored it. But we were starting to get information on him in 96 and 97. And the 9/11 Commission notes that. They've seen the evidence. So in 1997, we update the estimate. This is the one that's focused on terrorism and the potential threat to the United States. Here's what the 9/11 Commission finds. The only reference to bin Laden was this sentence: Iran and its surrogates, as well as terrorist financier Osama bin Laden and his followers, have stepped up their threats and surveillance of U.S. facilities. That's all we told the policy community. One sentence. Despite the fact the gentleman had publicly or issued a jihadist statement against the United States. It gets worse. Many classified articles for the morning briefs were prepared. The morning brief is the presidential daily brief. It goes to the President of the United States every day. Traditionally, it's been delivered to the president using a briefer from normally the CIA, that is expanded now today to include other agencies. The current president requires that the Director of National Intelligence or his deputy show up with the morning briefing. And the president reads it every day of the week. It's a document that they look at. George Bush had similar treatment. So here's the titles. I can't give you the content of what we were handing them. June 1998, bin Laden threatening to attack the U.S. with aircraft. January 1999, strains surfaced between the Taliban and bin Laden. February 2001, bin Laden's interest in biological and radiological weapons. That's bad karma as well. August 2001, this is the one that made the press. Bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. So as late as August 2001, we were telling the top decision makers that you had a problem on your hands. But it wasn't a loud message. It wasn't a drumbeat. And I can't tell you that it's fair to indict the intelligence or the policy community for not picking up on the stream, because that's a book that sometimes has 12 articles a day, maybe more. And so was there a continuity that the president could follow? Maybe not. Was there a threat? Well, we're pretty sure there was a threat. He was being told, but did it register? We don't know. Back to the intelligence community. As far back as 1999, we began to realize within the intelligence community that nobody was doing a strategic assessment of what bin Laden and his organization were up to. There was no complete portrait of his strategy. There was no complete report on his organization, and there was no complete report as to the extent of his plans for terrorist threats. Nobody in the intelligence community had touched that. In late December 2000, then Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, recognized that he had a problem on his hands. He said, what we need to do is stand up a strategic assessment cell focused on al-Qaeda. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to select 10 people in this agency, and that will be your job. 10. I guarantee you there are a lot more than 10 people working on al-Qaeda these days. And then they went searching for bodies. Now, terrorism was not the number one threat within the United States community at the time. So it took a while to round up those bodies. In fact, the gentleman who was to head that strategic assessment cell and take it forward and would subsequently lead it for a number of years showed up for his first day of work on 10 September 2001. Needless to say, the reports weren't written. It didn't happen. So when you say, why do we have a red cell? It's because we didn't learn our lessons. They were sitting there from 1941 and now 2001, and there was no forward progress. Well, what do we have within the intelligence community? If you look at the problems that we're confronting, there are 6 that come to the fore. One, we have structural barriers. We don't talk well with each other. I find it very difficult to contact my counterparts who work in other agencies across the community. 2, we lack a common set of standards and of practices. I do things very differently than the FBI does, than the Defense Intelligence Agency does. 3, we have divided management. Oh, yes. Well, we have a DNI. He sort of herds things. But each of the agencies is allowed to run its own operation. And so the analysts, in some senses, feel that they can go out and pursue their own interests. 4, we have the weak capacity to set priorities. 5, we have too many jobs. You had Dana Priest in here, and Dana will tell you that we have gone overboard in intelligence hiring. I would agree with her personally. I would agree with her. There are too many of us. And finally, we're too complex and we're too secret. I mean, this is a list that appears impossible to fix, and yet what I'm about to tell you is it's not as bad as you think. It isn't. We're actually starting to tackle this, and we're going to come to the red cell as we go through that process, and I want to think about where we're at. Let's go back to analysts for a minute. I have to say I'm flattered coming in here after you've had the journalist, and you've had General Hayden, and you got the guy from the sexy element of the job, right? The human guy came in and talked to you about covert operations and what they do. I mean, those are the special people. My fellow analysts were shocked that you actually invited an analyst to come in. I mean, we're the alchemists of the intelligence community. We're supposed to create gold out of the straw and base metals that they hand us. And nobody pays attention to us, right? They said, you get to actually go talk to other people, and they want to see you? And I said, well, my wife fooled Ralph, and he's invited me to come up here. The frequent complaint that you'll hear from folks in my side of the business is that we're ignored in peace and blamed in war. I would argue that the larger problem on the salesmanship side, I don't fall into this category, is that most intelligence analysts are true introverts. Their idea of communication is to send email between each other regardless of the fact that they're one cubicle away. They do that a lot. We can tell the extrovert in the intelligence community who's an analyst because they're the one in the elevator looking at other people's shoes. This is a community that's got some issues. So talking to each other is a hard one to break because you've got to convince people who don't like people that they're going to actually communicate. Now, it isn't just because we're introverts. It's also because we get a heavy hand of God for management. They like to micromanage analysts because we're easy to keep in the box. We don't fight back. And so it isn't unusual for an intelligence analyst at the working level to produce a document that before it's released has gone through 6 levels of edit. If you recognize the verbiage that's in the report by the time it gets to the final step, you're in luck. Often you don't. You can claim your ideas are still in it, but you don't really recognize the issue that you're at. It's because agencies want to send a particular message. They have a particular issue they want to resolve, or they believe the consumer wants to hear something else. The other debate that we run into frequently within the intelligence community is that the policy community does not want us to dictate to them. Oh, I teach at the National Intelligence University, so what I'm saying is, questionable at times. And I tell my analysts who are in there working on their master's degree that I think you should advocate policy. Now, there's a clever way to do that within an intelligence report. You say, here are your policy options, and here are the consequences of pursuing same. And you hope that you pick the one that the administration was on and you don't want them to choose and make it look bad. You can do that. You risk the danger of being yelled at. I have, by some of the best in the business. Mr. Fife had some polite things to say to me. Doug Fife. It's not a new problem. Bear with me. My vocabulary is foul. Not too foul, though. This is Lyndon Johnson, right? His was worse than mine, right? Let me tell you about these intelligence guys. And he's talking about analysts, by the way. When I was growing up in Texas, we had a cow named Bessie. I'd go out early and milk her. I'd get her in the stanchion, seat myself, and squeeze out a fresh pail of milk. One day, I had worked hard and gotten a full pail, but I wasn't paying attention, and old Bessie swung her shit-smeared tail through the bucket of milk. Now, that's what these intelligence guys do. You work hard, get a good program or policy going, and they swing a shit-smeared tail through it. How do you win as an analyst when that's the reception that you're getting from your customer? And we do refer to these guys as our customers. Right? So if you want to avoid being condemned by Lyndon Johnson and his like, you come up with a way of avoiding politicization, or at least you hope you do as an analyst. The facts, only the facts. Makes for a very bland product. But there's the concern going back to the WMD report you cited that said, well, we went out and did the research, and we tried to prove that Saddam was engaged in building a WMD program. And one of my former colleagues, who was a national intelligence officer for the Middle East at the time, Paul Pillar, did a study after he left government for foreign affairs. And in it, he said, I went out and interviewed the analysts. And I said, did you look at all the evidence? And Paul is an imposing figure and can wear you down. He's like going to see the polygrapher. he'll ask the question 14 different ways till you're wrong. And he says, what I couldn't find in the community was an analyst who said, no, I understood what the customer wanted. They wanted to go to war and they wanted WMD, so I changed the data. He said, I couldn't find that. He said, and I couldn't find evidence that the policy community was trying to drive the analyst into writing something that they otherwise wouldn't. I couldn't find that. But what I could find is ample evidence that the management, remember the 6 chains of edit, knew what the policy community wanted to hear and crafted the document to meet that requirement. So we're doing it to ourselves. Maybe we need to fix this. Let's go back then to those 6 problems that I laid out. What do we do with this? Let's start with the structural barriers. Are they as bad as we think they are? Well, normally I wander around with a lanyard around my neck because I have to have 6 badges to get into every place. I swipe in and they track me electronically. We solved some of that because, and this is considered a major victory, so bear with me, we have 1 badge that lets me into all the offices in the Washington, D.C. area. It's blue. If you're a contractor, it's green. So if you're in Washington, D.C., you can get into all the other facilities. If you leave Washington, D.C., no joy. And that includes going outside the Beltway, right, to the NRO. So it works kind of. So that's touted as a structural success. We have established IT systems that at least let us pass email to each other. You laugh, but that was a problem at one point. By the way, CIA still uses Lotus Notes. Anybody know what Lotus Notes is? Right. It's an old IBM program. We're updating this year. I think we're going to get Microsoft 2003. We're updating. But we can talk to each other now. We can. That's a structural fix. And we reorganize things. In the old days, the National Intelligence Council, sort of the wizened heads, the deans, if you will, of the community, belonged to the Director of Central Intelligence, the guy who runs CIA. Not anymore. Now they belong to the Director of National Intelligence. Oh, they're still parked at CIA, but they belong to the Director of National Intelligence. And the Presidential Daily Brief that used to belong to CIA now belongs to the Director of National Intelligence. So in a sense, we're trying to beat down the walls, but it's a huge bureaucracy. As Dana told you, there's at least 200,000 of us who are government employees and another 600 possible thousand who are on the contract side. And making that change doesn't happen overnight. What about the lack of common standards and practices? This is a fun one. I now get graded. Right? They hired these guys who retired from the intelligence community, and they gave them checklists. And they said, we're going to make sure you pesky analysts do this right. So they take your product, and they'll go through, and they'll go, well, you didn't source it correctly. This is like grading papers, right? So you didn't source it correctly. This is not a logical argument. And they send that report back to your manager. You don't get it, your manager does. Who then, of course, is irate that you would be foolish enough to put this product out after it went through their 6 levels of CHOP. But we've got standards and practices. We are, I will say on the positive side, working diligently to provide training programs to bring people up to those standards. And there has been a marked change from the day when I walked into the intelligence community 22 years ago and wrote a report and there wasn't a footnote in it. Trust me, I saw that traffic somewhere. It's up here. Now I have to actually be able to cite it like you would a good academic paper. So we've worked to change that problem. And we really have worked hard to try to figure out how to communicate with those new members of the intelligence community, law enforcement. Gone are the days when the FBI and the CIA didn't talk. Now they're part of the same team. Oh, by the way, so is DEA. So is the Coast Guard. So I have a whole new set of folks that I've never dealt with before. And they have a very different approach to intelligence than we do. In fact, they like to share it with us less than we like to share with them. Because they call their intelligence evidence and plan on using it in court. We never thought about it that way. So trying to get things out of them is nigh unto impossible. But there are new standards and there are new ways forward, and we're working on trying to accomplish it. What about the issue of divided management? Remember I told you that this was our number 3 problem? I'll tell you right now, not my problem. Way above my pay grade. It's still an issue. But I will say that the DNI is working, the Director of National Intelligence, is working hard to solve that problem. And among the initiatives that General Clapper has put into effect is the establishment of what he calls the National Intelligence Managers. So with each National Intelligence Officer, the guys who are on the National Intelligence Council, the graybeards, they have a gentleman or a gentlewoman who is charged with trying to herd the intelligence community, particularly the collections assets, to work with them. I don't know if this will survive General Clapper, but it's his idea, and he's pushing these guys hard to do it. So we're working to fix the management issue. What about the issue of prioritization? How do you know I'm doing the right thing and not just engaged in mental masturbation? And this is a problem that we have. We write intelligence for each other because it's classified top secret, no foreign, don't tell anybody. So my counterparts can read it, but nobody in the policy community can. That's not useful because you're spending $80 billion a year to keep me around. $80 billion. So maybe we should talk to our customer and see what they want. This is a novel idea. It's new, too. Every 6 months, since we stood up the Director of National Intelligence in 2005, we sit down with the President of the United States or his top advisors and sort through their list of priorities for the intelligence community. It's called the National Intelligence Priority Framework, NIPIF. And that document provides for the intelligence community, this is important because it gets the collections guys, they're the ones who get all the money, and the analysts, because it tells the managers where you want to rack and stack us, what the administration believes the global threats are by level. And then it breaks it out on a range of particular items, from proliferation to national politics. And you get little numbers in these matrices. So it's a very complicated document. And it says, here's what you're supposed to do. It looks great. It does. The problem is that the priority for the decision maker, and I think this is appropriate, changes daily. Daily. So what we've laid out as a long-term vision for the prioritization and use of the intelligence assets, is actually subject to the whims of the international community. You will yank and bank accordingly. And so the theory is there, the practice is much harder to realize. But we're trying. What about this issue of too many jobs? Again, I'm talking from Anderson's perspective. We have too many people doing what I do. There are 3 all-source agencies inside the Beltway. CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State Department runs an intelligence bureau as well. General Clapper has said, and he has been echoed by other people, that it's a good idea to do that this avoids groupthink, and therefore we'll get a better product in the long run. You'd be amazed how remarkably similar the products that come out are across the board. So maybe we could do this with a third less. Oh, by the way, the military commands also run all-source agencies. So maybe we could do it with half as much and save the money and produce the same material. Because we're all reading, by the way, the same reports when we put the items together. So we're arguing around the margins. By the way, it's like academia. The politics are very bitter because the stakes are so petty. So we fight with each other. I can't say you can take it all away. Because if you look at that number of bodies and you say, you're sitting there in the audience and say, this is incredible, why do we need that many people writing? It's because we have audiences at 3 different levels. The tactical level, the warfighter who wants to know where the enemy is in the field. The operational level, the planners who want to be able to get ready for something 5 years from now, not just tomorrow, and the strategic. So I have to balance that requirement across the board to make sure we're meeting all of those bodies. But do I need that many analysts to do it? Probably not. Probably not. All right. I promised you I'd get to the red cell. I haven't forgotten. I'll get there. But I have to answer the sixth item. We're too complex and we're too secret. In the wake of 9/11, we changed the policy for handling secrets. Traditionally, and when I went through the intelligence school, that was a year of people beating on me on how to spell secret correctly, you were told that you needed to share intelligence based on the need to know. Need to know. That's a hard criterion, because how do I know what I need if I don't know if it's out there? It's sort of, Rumsfeld, tell me what I know, what you don't know, and what I assume, the knowns, unknowns, something like that, right? We didn't know that the FBI had been receiving reports of people attending flight schools who weren't interested in learning how to land. We didn't know because nobody shared it, and we didn't need to know because it wasn't material that traditionally went to the intelligence community. So how was I supposed to put that piece together that said, yeah, we have these guys that we know have been associated with terrorist organizations, and oh, by the way, they're engaged in the following training. So the policy changed. It went from need to know to need to share. Oh, I'm going to get everything. And if you're me, that's a pig in mud. I'm an addict when it comes to information. I get 3 newspapers at home every morning. Can't read them all ever, but I get them, so I can look at them. My wife complains because I have NPR on endlessly. I go to work and I immediately open my email, all 3 accounts of it. I have a unclassified, a secret level, and a top secret level. And that's just the beginning, because then you get all the stuff that's reported through on the channels. So I'm a junkie when it comes to information, and they're going to share it all with me. Woo! 5,000 messages a day. Now, I can scan through that. I read pretty fast. I can get through about 500 pages a day of comprehensible material. I don't move my lips anymore when I read. Wore 'em out. But will the important piece register with me? I don't know. I hope it does. I hope that I've been looking at this long enough so that I'm going to actually grab the piece that says, hey, boss, this is bad. I'm trained in pattern recognition, and when I get a deviation, that means I should do something. I hope. Need to share is going to go away. Not because they wore me out. It's this pesky thing called Wikileaks. Need to share meant that private Manning, nope, not Major Manning, private Manning, had access to all the same materials that I do at the secret level. All of it. So when he pulled out his thumb drive, I tried to cut mine off with a steak knife the other night, and plugged it into that machine, he was able to download an amazing number of things. They're not there anymore. In order to solve that problem, most of the agencies have now taken up to classifying their materials with the following caveat: originator controlled. So if you want to use that material, you have to call them and beg them. This, as an analyst, makes life hard and slower. Sometimes I joke that in the intelligence community, we specialize in doing yesterday's news tomorrow in order to get the data out from where it's been sequestered. And then there's the issue of complexity. Who else is working this, given all of this stuff flowing at me? How are we going to do it? Now, there are fixes in place for this as well. By the way, we now have our own version of Wikipedia. It's classified. It's called Intellipedia. It's cool stuff. I use it as much as I use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is awesome, people. And we have blog sites on the classified side. And they've developed a tweeter function for the intelligence community, Twitter. Now, I still defy somebody to tell me what great insight you glean from 140 characters, but it's there. So what does the red cell do with that? Why do I have a red cell? If you go back and look at the red cell, what you discover is that we were stood up 2 days after 9/11. George Tenet came down and said to the folks at the senior level in the building, I want an organization that does 2 things. Tell me what others don't. We do that. Make the seniors uncomfortable. I rejoice. That's what we're there to do. We're asked, and we have a very small cadre, that many digits, cover us, of very experienced people who've been working at this for a long time, who have different backgrounds. I'm a political scientist by trade. I muck about in economics. One of my counterparts is the expert in Arab affairs. I have another one who works macro business issues. We come at the problems from a different look, from a different field. All of us have at least a master's degree, and we've published a lot. We like to scribble. I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic organization to be in. Now, the other thing that we do is we don't take people just from the CIA. Shocking. It was for the CIA when I showed up, because I work for the DNI, and they hate the DNI. And now I wander around in their building with a lanyard that says DNI on it all the time. I also have a counterpart who comes out of the National Security Agency. So we're sweeping across the breadth of the intelligence community, and we're looking at the problems from different perspective, and we're telling people, maybe we should think about this in another manner. Well, how do we get there? My boss likes to say there are 6 things that stand out. I tell her there's 5. We're contrarians. The first thing that we tell people is that we are idea-driven. Now, academics look at me and they go, what's novel about that? The intelligence community as a whole has traditionally been fact-driven. The facts, ma'am, just the facts. I get to actually go talk to my friends in the think tanks and in academia, and I read a lot of op-eds. Get some great stuff out of the op-eds, by the way. There's some real wackos out there, too. Right? But you can bring those ideas back into work and say, hey, what happens if we frame all this stuff this way? Foreignpolicy.com, by the way, if you want a real great place to go to read new ideas that are coming up. Free, daily. We read it religiously. We focus on the future. Not only the future, sort of what it could be, the possibilities and the opportunities. I'm not here to tell people it's all bad. Sometimes we tell people what's good. We challenge the conventional wisdom. Typically, my product will start with, the mainstream believes, but the red cell wonders, see, we can't say the red cell believes, wonders what would happen if. Causes headaches. I'll come back to that. Right? We believe and we'll try something different. We, unlike the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief, don't coordinate with the rest of the community. I don't ask anybody else whether they approve my product. We'll share it with them, just so they know what's about to happen to them. It causes grief, believe me. This will make me do more work. Well, that's why they pay you. We'll share it with you, but you don't get to coordinate. And we cross boundaries. What do I mean by that? It is not unusual, for instance, for us to be asked to take a political problem and disassemble it using economic models. Not typically the way we approach things within the community. It's not unusual whatsoever for me to be asked, as a Northeast Asia specialist, and this happened to me, to work on the Arab Spring. I can find Kuwait on a map, I've been to Iraq a couple of times. I don't know anything about Egypt. I spent 6 months last year working on Arab Spring because I didn't know anything about it, therefore I wasn't going to be the mainstream. I was going to ask the questions that said, hey, what happens if this doesn't work? Or what happens if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over and it's good? That one was not warmly received. Not warmly received. I got asked very hard questions. I have to say that if you don't read history today, you don't want to work for us. We dredge things up. We like the end of the Russian Empire. We like the end of the Soviet Union. I've spent a lot of time looking at the traditional caliphate because historical analysis provides us with a different perspective than what you would get out of reading the newspaper. A lot of people don't do that. My favorite place to go do research, by the way, right now, is the CIA library. Books. They have a lot of them. They never come off the shelves anymore. People don't use them. So they're there all the time, and you can pull them out. We're back to doing things sort of a more traditional academic approach than what people would think. We'll write papers from a first-person narrative. I've actually written letters from a leader to his son that then goes out as a product, so that your reader gets a very different perspective as to what we're trying to accomplish. We make people think about how they're doing the business. So how do we do this? The first thing that I tell people who walk into our office when we invite them to talk about a product is I want you to understand your biases. Tell me your assumptions before you even start the conversation. It's shocking how many people will write a product who haven't even thought about what's underlying that material. I tell them to be contrarian. My wife says I specialize in that. The answer to that problem is no. Not yes, no. And here's why. Now, I don't make things up. It's factual-based material. I take the same reporting that people in the community use to write the mainstream, and I turn it on its head. It works. What if a stalemate in Libya would be a good idea? It'll give us time to sort out who's going to replace Muammar, right? That's not what people want to hear. You want a war to end soon. Well, maybe it'd be better if we let them wait. Huh? Bypass the traditional organizations. My chop chain goes from my boss to the director of analysis. We don't go through 6 chops. We're going right to the top end of the business. Okay? Right. And we stay out of the weeds. Let me close up by noting a couple of things. This is a model that people look at as a vision of success. It's also been painful for the community to deal with. There is a very real probability that it's going to go away. In trying to replace people, I come off of my shift on this organization in May. They can't find another person to put in there. There's a concern within the community that you can't get promoted working within the red cell. I'm a terminal GS-15. That's okay with me. There is a concern that by doing what we do, we potentially could embarrass the policy community. Because now we're calling into question the very assumptions that drive intelligence forward. And there is a concern that there will be political backlash from management. The management does not like the fact that we make people uncomfortable, both inside the building and outside the building. And so what was stood up now 10 years ago has a very real possibility of no longer remaining in business. In other organizations, the red cell has diminished itself down to a body of 1, who then tries to coordinate with other people to get the products written. Well, let me close by offering a few observations of where we're at in my business. And it goes back to some of the comments that you had made on what does the future look like for us. 1, I'm in danger of being put out of business by my competition. In the old days, LBJ's comment, there was one group of people who had a monopoly on the facts, and that was the intelligence community. That is no longer the case. When I go to conferences, and I get a chance to do it fairly frequently, I always love the academic who comes up to me and says, but at least they read your stuff. Meanwhile, we're over telling our colleagues, I wish I was in academia because they read their stuff. The policy community pulls its data from a multiple of places, including the media, think tanks, academia, and then occasionally the intelligence community. And it's hard for us to compete with that because the sources seem to be exponentially growing. Second, technology is drowning me. I now have to read the blog sites, keep up with the media, and all the print, plus the classified stuff. I don't know how I'm going to parse through all that data. It's getting there, and I'm not the only person who comes out with that. And third and finally, we're going to downsize. It's inevitable. We're not going to continue to spend $80 billion a year in the intelligence community if we believe that Al-Qaeda is going away and that we no longer are going to be at war in Iraq or Afghanistan. And what happens when you start taking those bodies away and the information hasn't diminished in size? But I will say, for all of my grumbling and complaints, that I wouldn't trade my job for anything. I love what I do. I get to go in every day and read somebody else's mail, take that information and give it to somebody who would do that person harm. And if they succeed, I get a pat on the back and some recognition. You can't do that in the real world. Thank you.
Thanks. Eric, before we take questions from our audience, did I hear you correctly say that 11 years after the 9/11 attacks, we're still trying to figure out what the problems are? We didn't learn our lessons between 1941 and 2001, and we're still trying to work to fix the problems?
It's a process that reflects the bureaucratic structure that's sitting within Washington, D.C. People have jobs in management. People have budgets that are allocated to their organizations, and they fight tooth and nail to keep them. When you believe that your organization is in danger of being outmoded, you change focus. And so where we traditionally had 3 agencies doing all source intelligence analysis, now almost every agency will do that. Because it's a way of getting your product in front of the President of the United States and putting your logo up in front of people in order to justify your money. And where we have stood up new organizations, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, you have a nightmare on your hands. Because you took a group of disparate agencies, shoved them under a single roof, and said, cooperate and coordinate, guys, or you go out of business. They neither cooperate nor coordinate. They show up and fight with each other at meetings that I attend. And so you have a continuing learning process, and it's part of bureaucracy. The bigger it gets, the slower it changes.
You talked a little bit about terrorism. You mentioned Al-Qaeda quite a bit, and we've heard a lot in this series about counterterrorism. Are there other threats around the world that the United States that you pay attention to in your daily work because there are plenty of other people worrying about terrorism?
I don't do terrorism. I don't do terrorism because there are too many people doing terrorism. I would tell you that if I look out, and I was asked this today by some of the students, and he said, so where do you see the threats? And I said, remember, this is just Anderson talking. I said, aside from our own national debt, which we in the intelligence community are really frowned upon talking about, you have to look at what the Chinese are doing and ask where their direction. Is it a benevolent direction, or is it someplace that puts them up as a peer competitor? Certainly we have to ask what the Iranians are doing. Now, the intelligence community said we don't have clear evidence that they intend to build a nuclear device. I don't worry about the North Koreans, by the way. Put them away, they're done. We can stop sweating that one. The one that we don't talk about is the potential for Africa to be the next Asia. Because here you have a labor pool that's cheaper than what's available in Asia, is now starting to reach educational levels that were previously unheard of, is putting in the infrastructure necessary to develop that process, and yet we in the United States pay almost no attention to Africa and can't answer the questions as to what will be emerging within that environment as it starts to bring in industry, as it starts to bring in money. Do I sweat the Middle East? Only in that we don't know how Arab Spring is going to come out. It could still go either direction. I don't worry, by the way, about the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that what you have there is an organization, when you read into their literature, that essentially has a desire to put into effect something that looks like a socialist state, much like the Ba'athist Party was in Iraq originally. That it's there to take care of the good of the people. How they're going to pay for that, I don't know. But I don't think that you're going to see the rise of a fundamentalist state in any of the newly emerging Arab democracies.
Let's turn to some questions from our audience. We traditionally alternate between questions from students and non-students, so I'll look first for a question from a student. Is there a question from a student? Yes, sir.
Is there a interagency exchange program of intelligence personnel that could help, I guess, each agency look at things differently?
The question is there an interagency exchange program of personnel that could help one agency take on a different perspective from another agency?
There is. We call it the Joint Duty Program. It was stood up under the Director of National Intelligence, and the intention was to duplicate in some sense what we do within the U.S. military, and that is to assign people out of their service and into another one for a tour of duty so that you could gain insight as to what was being accomplished at that agency. It has not worked well, primarily for two reasons. One, people are afraid to leave their agency because if they walk out the door, they will be forgotten in the promotion process. And two, because many of the agencies figured out how to game the system, and so they declared certain billets inside of their own agency joint, and therefore all you had to do was move inside of your own agency and you got joint duty credit. It's a program that they're working to fix, and they have full intention of accomplishing it. But again, it's a slow process in order to make that happen. But yes, you're right. The vision from the DNI is that if you want to make the senior ranks of the intelligence community, you will have to accomplish one of these tours.
Question from a non-student? Yes, sir.
What's your view on asymmetric threats, terrorism, and politically weak counterparties?
Question is, what is your view on asymmetric threats, terrorism, for example?
And the other half is,
Can't hear the other half.
well, that was the point. The other half is, which ones do you sweat most, the asymmetric or a heavy-duty counterparty like Russia to the Soviet Union?
All right, question is the asymmetric threats, meaning the so-called small threats from terrorism versus a large army like the Soviets or perhaps China's military.
Can I push back on you a little bit? Okay. We like to talk about, this is my contrarian coming out. We like to talk about asymmetric threats. It's a sexy term. It gets people's attention, right? What army on this planet goes to war almost completely at night? What air force on this planet flies almost all of its missions at night? Who has equipped almost all of its munitions with GPS-guided capabilities? I'll give you a hint. That's us. So does that make us an asymmetric threat? Right. There are threats, right? And what I take asymmetric threat to mean is that it's not the conventional thinking of here's your tank battalions rolling up against the enemy's tank battalions. It's not the Fogel Gap in Europe. Right? Those days are done. We're not going to do that again.
I'll tell you what, we're not going to have a dialogue. We asked a question twice. Let's hear the answer.
So do I think, given that answer, that we are going to be confronted with a conventional enemy who is going to challenge us on a one-on-one basis like the Soviets did? No. No. Even the Chinese don't want to press down that path.
And is there a large army threat to the United States at this point?
The Canadians haven't gotten that big, and the Mexicans are busy. No.
The answer is no. Okay. We, as you know, we are webcast on something called Second Life, and we have a question from a viewer in Hawaii right now, who's asking, you mentioned Twitter, you mentioned Facebook, that you keep track of the social media. To what extent does your analysis deal with what's going on in virtual worlds, whether it's Second Life or others that might be out there, people who are living in cyberspace?
The intelligence community, I think, and people across academia learned a valuable lesson as they watched what transpired in Tunisia and then in Egypt and what almost happened in Iran with the Green Revolution. And that was that the youth of today are communicating using means other than the traditional telephone and telegraphs and faxes. And it's an organizing tool. And we've learned that we need to watch that as well, that that's another source of information. I don't know, I can't personally speak to the question of whether or not we're watching Second Life type programs. But if it's social media, we pay attention to it. Not in the United States, by the way, we do follow the law. We're trying to gauge how useful that is as an indicator of where events are headed. And so it's, if you will, another means of communication that we have to monitor, and we do try to follow it.
Do you think that the attention that's paid to asymmetric or terrorism threats by the intelligence agencies kind of distracts attention among those $80 billion worth of people every year from other threats that you think are, from those other ones that you mentioned that are more important?
I figured how I can answer this for you. The intelligence community exists to service one master, ideally, and that's the executive branch of the U.S. government. And if the executive branch of the U.S. government determines that its priority threat is terrorism, the intelligence community will change to answer that dynamic. When the executive branch determines that something else is its priority, the intelligence community will run as quickly as possible in that direction. Unfortunately, we tend to do it like kindergartners on the soccer field. Everybody runs there. And in trying to sort out how to avoid that is a difficult question because it involves money. And if this is the priority, then run at it because you'll get cash. Have we spent too much time on terrorism? My personal response would be yes. We could have done this with fewer people. We need to be watching the other problems. And if you look at the Director of National Intelligence testimony, and he does this every February and it's available online, you can read through a litany in those 40 pages of threats that range from cybersecurity to water supplies and global climate change. We watch those things from an intelligence perspective because they affect national security. And so how do you balance out all those requirements and what's the top and what's the bottom? Remember I mentioned the NIPIF that is supposed to help us reach that requirement.
To me, it sounds a little like a recipe for disaster. How can you connect the dots on something you're not really paying full attention to if that's the one that turns out to be the big problem in the future?
That is the risk you take. You will miss things. There will always be intelligence failures because you have people working in the intelligence community, we're not machines, and events that transpire that would have never caused someone to think about the potential consequence. The fact that a fruit vendor set himself ablaze in a back village in Tunisia and subsequently caused a revolution that not only toppled the government there, but in Egypt, threatened Bahrain, increasingly appears to be pushing Mr. Assad in Syria into the danger zone, and potentially calls into question the existence of the Jordanian state as we know it, was unfathomable at the time. It's hard to connect all those dots. So we do the best we can based on what we're told are the priorities and where we think things are going next. And then you ask people like the Red Cell to say, well, what else is sitting out there? And we get questions like that. We're asked to go look at things that are out of the blue just in case.
Question from a student. Yes, sir.
You mentioned some examples of unconventional thinking, like that the Muslim Brotherhood might be good, that kind of thing, or missing certain things like the Arab Spring coming. Do you guys ever think about the so-called totally unthinkable scenarios, like a major government collapsing in Europe or something like that, that would be, our ally right now? We have no reason to question it, but suddenly it wouldn't be for some reason.
Okay,
Absolutely.
question is, you pay attention to unconventional thinking. Do you ever think about what the questioner described as something totally unthinkable, like a total government collapse of a major ally in Europe, for example?
Or like, could Mr. Putin lose the election? Yeah, we do. I mean, in fact, it's usually more fun to do things like that. Like, why not write a paper that says, the Greeks really should default? What? Yes, because we want people to look at this and say, there is an alternative approach to handling that, and it's not just the minor details that can bite you, but sometimes it's the people right in front of you who can be the most unpleasant in the long run. Well, yeah.
Are there any threats like that out there that you can point us to that we should be paying attention to that aren't getting the attention? Greece is one we've all paid attention to, but...
Paid attention to Greece, yes. At this point, wow, you put me on the spot.
Sorry. Wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah. Things that we're not paying attention to. Again, I would go back to Africa and look at potentials that are sitting there in sub-Saharan Africa. When we don't spend a lot of time on it. We watch Nigeria because of the oil supply. If you wanted to see probably the most ignored portion of the planet, it's just south of the Panama Canal. We don't spend a lot of time on Latin America. Well, we babysit Mr. Chavez because he's nuts. But the rest of it, we don't spend as much time on. It'll be a shame. If Mr. Chavez dies, we'll have nobody left. Gaddafi is gone. Chavez is gone. Saddam has departed. We need another loony on the global stage.
Question from a non-student? Yes, sir. Question is about the current leadership in the intelligence agencies. How do they interact with each other? The appointment of a military leader in a previously civilian post and the appointment of a civilian leader in the Defense Department.
David is a delightful guy. He's still not used to being called David. Something about that general used to be in front of it. He admits that the first time that happened to him in the corridor, he realized he was in a very different culture. He walked in to the agency and was quick to say, I respect what you do. He's obviously had disagreements with the agency previously. He has been careful to avoid stepping on toes. He is a ridiculously bright guy, which sometimes we forget, and he has more outside context than you can possibly imagine. In fact, periodically, you'll find yourself answering things because he's received an email from one of his friends in the outside world. And so he's proven to be, I think, a good fit. He's not the first military officer, obviously, to head the Central Intelligence Agency. As best we can tell, Mr. Panetta moving down to DOD has been a good thing. Mr. Panetta in the intelligence community has sort of an interesting reputation that if you'll recall that there was this guy named Denny Blair, used to be an admiral who used to be the DNI. And Mr. Blair got into a bureaucratic squabble with Mr. Panetta over other things, naming the chiefs of station and who was going to have the responsibility and the ability to do that. Mr. Blair believed that as the Director of National Intelligence and the owner, by the way, of the Central Intelligence budget, that he should have that privilege. And Mr. Panetta, with much push from his employees, because they didn't want to lose that privilege, said no. And that argument went all the way to the White House. Mr. Panetta is now the Secretary of Defense, and Mr. Blair is looking for work somewhere. So Mr. Panetta has proven that he understands how to operate within Washington, and he certainly understands how to maintain context between the two. The relationship, if you would ask, how do they balance that out? Keep in mind that the majority of the collection assets within the intelligence community belong to the Department of Defense. NSA works for the Department of Defense. The National Reconnaissance Office works for the Department of Defense. The National Geospatial Agency works for the Department of Defense. So most of the data that Mr. Petraeus is going to be dependent upon, or his subordinates, has to come from DoD, and you really want to keep them on your side. So as best we can tell, the two, to this point in time, are getting along swimmingly. Like to keep it that way.
Eric, you spoke in class this afternoon about all the toys, that was your word, that the intelligence community has at its disposal. Satellite imagery, aircraft imagery, drone data, both signals intelligence and photographs, human intelligence, all of the other aspects, all the other things that are coming in your way. But your remarks tonight suggest that that technology is not necessarily the most important part of figuring out what's going to happen, trying to get at that predictive capability of intelligence. Talk about that a little bit. Why aren't those toys as important?
The toys give me the dots. They do. They're supposed to provide the data necessary for me to reach conclusions. But those dots are disparate events. And they appear randomly. It's a little strange sometimes because you'll go wandering through your emails and through the various sources that are flowing in, and you go, I wonder why this is sitting here. And they don't mean much alone. And it requires analysts with perspectives on the problem to put those things together. What I like to remind my brethren in the collection business, who, by the way, get 70% of the budget and believe they own the intelligence community, is that they work for me. That's a rude awakening if you own all the satellites, or you're the guy who collects human intelligence, and you have some geeky character wearing a tie and a suit who sits behind a computer all day long telling you, no kidding, that's mine. And here's what you'll go do. But if you don't have that, then you're not producing data using those systems that's of value to contribute to the policy-making process. Remember that we're tasked from the intelligence community by the Director of National Intelligence and by the mission statements that are resident within most of the intelligence community statements to enable wise policy making. Now, the collectors typically don't pay attention to domestic politics, nor do they pay attention to the policy statements. They're busy building better widgets. I do. I read the paper from the policy side every day. We go down to the meetings downtown to talk to these guys almost once a week, because we're asked to take those pieces and put them together. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. So while the analysts will whine that we're alchemists and that we're ignored, we really many times feel like we are the front face of the intelligence community. And when it comes back and people say you failed, the place where that beating takes the heaviest toll is within the Director of Intelligence divisions. This is where the analysts reside, what we call the DI. And that's where the hammer blow really comes down, because we're the ones who failed. We failed to take what was out there and put it together.
Question from a non-student? Yes, in the back.
My question is, how big or how much of a role does consensus play in NIEs and at the National Intelligence Council level when you have to do this process?
Okay, the question is, what role does consensus play? Do you always seek consensus when you're writing those really top-level important documents that are going to the President, the Secretary of State, and Sec Defense every day?
That's a damn good question. And the answer isn't as simple as you think. In writing an NIE, the body of the document has to reflect the consensus of the community, the body of the document. However, the policy community has made it very clear in the wake of the WMD NIE that they want to see any non-concur statement. So if you are an agency that does not agree with the materials or the conclusions that have gone into the NIE, you will be granted the right to publish with that document, in a tone box that stands out, your disagreement and why. And that is in the in-stone rule for the way that the National Intelligence Council operates. So while there's a danger, and you can hear it periodically come up in the way that people perceive the NIEs, that it looks like we've watered this thing down to garbage, it can do that. We retain now that special page where people can come back and say, no, here's why. And what we've discovered is that the policy community sometimes flips to that first, because it's more interesting reading, honestly.
Is that the mechanism, though, would that mechanism have brought to the forefront the fact that some guys were out there learning to fly planes but not learning to land them? Is that enough to bring that kind of data into the top levels?
If there had been an NIE written that said, here's the data that we laid out in the 9/11 Commission report, and the following was there, but the analysts disagreed over what it meant, it would have gone into a tone box. Would the policymaker have known that that's important? It depends on how, and this is important as well, it depends on how that non-concur statement is phrased. If it comes across as being whiny and snippy, and some of them are, remember I told you analysts are like academics, they squabble. If it's whiny and snippy, it gets ignored. If it is laid out with substantive fact, and then a logically put together assessment, it gets a traction that otherwise would be left behind. And so, yes, it works.
Question from a student? Question from a student? Yes, over here, ma'am.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the amount of intelligence sharing that we do with other countries.
Question is, how much intelligence sharing do we do with other countries? And I'll broaden that to expand to say with other countries, both friends and enemies.
I can't say a lot on this, obviously. I will tell you that I have briefed in more nations than most of you have ever visited, if that helps. I will tell you that the level of that relationship is dependent on the agency, and it varies across agencies widely. It depends upon the nation, and that varies widely. And do we share with people who are potential adversaries? Some of you may recall that at one point in time, Saddam Hussein was at war with Iran. Need I say more? The international dynamic that the policy community works within changes regularly. We refer to frenemies sometimes. That actually appeared in a document, by the way. I was amazed. I think the analysts have bets over what kind of funny words they can get into the products occasionally. Yes, we do. We share in multiple occasions with other people because we get a reciprocal response. And so it's not a one-way relationship that's taking place here. There are things we want and things that other people want. And so you're trying to balance out the exchange of information so you get the maximum bang for your buck. And that's really honestly more all I can say on that.
I don't know if you want to do this, but I'm going to ask you, following up on that question, what about a country like Pakistan that is nominally a U.S. ally in the war against terrorism and particularly the war in Afghanistan, but we apparently didn't share everything we knew with Pakistan about leading up to the raid that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden. What about a country like that that's a friend? Maybe you don't want to comment specifically on that country, but how do you make the decision about whether to share, whether it's beneficial to share or not to share with a country that's in that kind of position?
The ultimate decision to share intelligence with another nation comes through the executive branch of the government. Okay? This isn't the intelligence community arbitrarily running out and making a decision as to what we're going to do. And the presence or absence of that relationship speaks volumes as to the trust that we have with whom we're going to exchange that data. If we trust that they will maintain it and use it appropriately, there's a high probability that they'll be granted. If we don't think that we can trust them, it's much like you would deal with your wayward children. You don't give them the keys to the car. And so we have handled relationships that are that prickly in a manner that's intended to reflect what we believe the opposite party will do and the consequences for us if they don't behave.
And the mirror image of that question is, what if a friend shares intelligence with us and it crosses your computer screen, such and such an ally, prominent, long-standing U.S. ally, provides this piece of information? How implicitly do you trust it? Do you have to go back and try to duplicate or cross-check it or something? Or are there certain countries with whom you say, if they say it, I buy in?
There are certain countries whose relationship with us is so good, and you can think of them, that we treat them as an equal in business. They're that good. And the analysts don't question whether or not we can actually use that material or we need to go out and find another source. You have to do that because, as I've been saying, you have, despite the fact we spend as much money as we do, a limited number of resources that can go out and get this material, and I can't duplicate that function globally. And so I have to depend upon other places for their data. By the way, I think the media is a damn good intelligence source. And sometimes I trust their reporting more than I trust mine, because unlike mine that can be written and published with one source in it, the New York Times, I know, has gone out and validated the story with at least 2 people. That's pretty good. And typically, the Times will go much further than that. And so when it comes to the question of trust, know who you're getting the data from and understand the relationships that it's existent, but don't get too caught up in it.
All right. Before we say thanks to Eric Anderson, let me tell you just briefly about our next program. Next week on Wednesday, April 11th, we'll meet Melissa Hathaway, whose work on cybersecurity, or threats from the computer world and the internet, was key to the White House establishment of a cybersecurity unit at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. To be sure you don't miss announcements about programs like this, be sure to put yourself on the list. There's a bright orange sheet on the table outside the auditorium tonight. Please print clearly your email address, and you'll be sure to get notices about these programs. Now, please, let's thank our speaker tonight, Eric Anderson. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming.